In the bustling hallways of Jefferson Elementary School in Richmond, Virginia, a young black teacher named Keisha Williams was about to make a decision that would cost her everything she'd worked for. When she witnessed a quiet, overlooked student being tormented by his classmates, she had no idea that her choice to stand up for him would reveal a secret that would change both their lives forever. What she didn't know was that the shy boy she was protecting had a mother whose true identity would shock everyone at the school. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning bell at Jefferson Elementary School rang with its usual sharp urgency, echoing through hallways that had seen decades of children's laughter, tears, and dreams. Keisha Williams adjusted the strap of her worn leather messenger bag and took a deep breath, preparing herself for another day in the trenches of public education. At 26, she possessed the kind of passionate idealism that veteran teachers both admired and quietly worried would be crushed by the system's relentless demands. Keisha had graduated from Virginia State University with a degree in elementary education and a minor in special needs learning. Her student teaching experiences had been challenging but rewarding, filled with moments that reminded her why she'd chosen this profession despite the modest salary and overwhelming workload. She believed deeply that every child deserved an advocate, someone who would see their potential even when they couldn't see it themselves. Jefferson Elementary sat in a transitional neighborhood of Richmond where gentrification was slowly creeping in but hadn't yet displaced the working-class families who had called this area home for generations. The school served a diverse population: black children from longtime Richmond families, Latino students whose parents worked multiple jobs to make ends meet, white kids from families struggling with economic uncertainty, and a growing number of students from various backgrounds. As the neighborhood slowly changed, the building itself showed its age in ways both charming and concerning. Original hardwood floors creaked underfoot, radiators clanged with personality during winter months, and tall windows let in beautiful natural light, while occasionally letting in drafts that no amount of weather stripping could fully seal. Administration did its best with limited resources, but teachers like Keisha often found themselves spending their own money on supplies, decorations, and snacks for students who arrived hungry. Keisha's classroom was a reflection of her personality and teaching philosophy. Colorful posters covered the walls with motivational messages written in both English and Spanish. A cozy reading corner featured a small bookshelf filled with stories representing diverse characters and experiences. Student artwork was displayed prominently, each piece accompanied by encouraging comments written in Keisha's careful handwriting. She had created an environment where learning felt safe and joyful, where mistakes were viewed as opportunities rather than failures. Her third-grade class this year presented the usual mix of personalities and challenges. There was Aisha, a brilliant reader who devoured chapter books but struggled with math anxiety. Jeremy brought enough energy for 3 children and needed frequent movement breaks to stay focused. Sophia was still learning English but showed remarkable artistic talent that Keisha tried to incorporate into lessons whenever possible. And then there was Timothy Chun. Timothy was the kind of student who could easily disappear in a crowded classroom. Small for his age, with dark hair that perpetually fell across his forehead and eyes that seemed to hold secrets, he rarely spoke unless directly addressed. His clothes were always clean, but slightly too large, as if his mother bought them expecting growth spurts that hadn't yet materialized. While other children chattered excitedly during recess or lunch, Timothy usually sat alone, often with a book or quietly observing the social dynamics around him. What concerned Keisha most wasn't Timothy's reserved nature. Some children were simply introverted, but the deliberate isolation that seemed imposed upon him by his classmates. She'd noticed the way other students avoided sitting near him, how they'd move away if he approached their groups, the whispered comments that stopped abruptly when she drew near. Timothy never complained, never reported incidents, never asked for help. He simply endured with a quiet dignity that broke Kaisha's heart. The bullying was subtle but persistent. Books would mysteriously fall from Timothy's desk. His lunch would get accidentally knocked over. Group projects somehow never had room for one more member when he approached. Other teachers might have missed these microaggressions, but Kaisha had developed a keen eye for the social dynamics that could make or break a child's school experience. She'd tried various approaches to help Timothy integrate better with his classmates. She'd assigned him to different groups for activities, hoping to spark friendships through shared tasks. She'd highlighted his academic strengths. Timothy was exceptionally bright, particularly in mathematics and science, hoping to earn him respect from peers. She'd even spoken privately with some of the more influential students in class, asking them to include Timothy in their activities. Nothing seemed to work. If anything, her intervention sometimes made things worse, marking Timothy as the teacher's pet and giving his tormentors more ammunition. The boy himself seemed resigned to his situation, accepting isolation as an unchangeable fact of his school life. During parent-teacher conferences, his mother, a quiet woman who seemed perpetually rushed and tired, would nod politely at Kaisha's concerns but offer little insight into Timothy's home life or suggestions for improvement. Mrs. Chen worked long hours at what appeared to be multiple jobs, based on the varied uniforms Kaisha had glimpsed during brief pickup encounters. She spoke English with a slight accent and seemed overwhelmed by the demands of single parenthood. Kaisha had tried to connect with her, offering resources for after-school programs and suggesting strategies for building Timothy's confidence at home, but their interactions remained brief and somewhat formal. The social hierarchy among 8- and 9-year-olds could be surprisingly complex and cruel. At Jefferson Elementary, certain children had already established themselves as leaders, usually those who were athletic, outgoing, or came from families with more resources. These social dynamics were influenced by factors the children themselves barely understood: whose parents drove newer cars, who had the latest toys or clothes, who lived in certain neighborhoods versus others. Timothy fit none of the criteria for elementary school social success. He was bookish rather than athletic, quiet rather than charismatic, and his clothes, while clean, clearly came from discount stores rather than trendy retailers. More damaging to his social standing was the fact that he was different in ways that children found easy to target. His mixed heritage made him not quite fitting into any single ethnic group. His intelligence made him seem odd to classmates who preferred playground games to academic discussions, and his reserved nature was interpreted as standoffishness rather than shyness. The ringleader of Timothy's tormentors was a boy named Brandon Phillips, whose father owned several local businesses and whose mother was active in the school's parent organization. Brandon was naturally charismatic, good at sports, and possessed the kind of casual confidence that attracted followers. He wasn't necessarily malicious by nature, but he discovered that picking on Timothy earned laughs from classmates and made him feel powerful in the way that only childhood hierarchies can provide. Brandon's campaign against Timothy was sophisticated for elementary school standards. He rarely engaged in outright aggression that would catch teachers' attention. Instead, he orchestrated social exclusion, spreading rumors about Timothy's family, encouraging others to avoid him, and creating an atmosphere where being kind to Timothy became socially risky for other students. The few children who might have naturally befriended Timothy found themselves having to choose between including him and maintaining their own social standing. Kaisha watched these dynamics with growing frustration and professional concern. She understood child development well enough to know that this period of Timothy's life could have lasting impacts on his self-esteem, social skills, and academic performance. Children who experienced persistent bullying often carried those wounds into adolescence and adulthood, affecting their ability to form relationships, take risks, and believe in their own worth. The school's anti-bullying policies looked comprehensive on paper but proved difficult to implement in practice. Most incidents Timothy experienced were subtle enough to deny or dismiss. When Keisha reported her concerns to the administration, she was told to document specific instances, but Timothy's reluctance to report incidents made building a case challenging. The boy seemed to believe that seeking help would only make his situation worse, a belief that wasn't entirely unfounded given the social dynamics at play. Principal Richardson was a well-meaning woman in her 50s who genuinely cared about student welfare but was overwhelmed by the demands of running an underfunded school with too many students and too few resources. She trusted her teachers to handle classroom management issues and preferred not to get involved in what she termed normal childhood conflicts unless absolutely necessary. When Keisha brought Timothy's situation to her attention, Principal Richardson suggested strategies that Keisha had already tried and reminded her that some children simply took longer to find their social footing. The school counselor, Mrs. Patterson, was shared between 3 elementary schools and was typically only available at Jefferson on Tuesdays and Thursdays. While she was excellent at crisis intervention and working with students who had identified special needs, she had little time for preventive work or addressing subtle social issues like Timothy's situation. Keisha had requested that Timothy be scheduled for some individual counseling sessions, but the waiting list was extensive and reserved primarily for students with more acute problems. Keisha found herself staying late many evenings, trying to develop creative solutions to help Timothy. She researched best practices for helping isolated students, consulted with former professors, and even reached out to other teachers through online forums seeking advice. She began incorporating more collaborative learning activities into her curriculum, hoping to create natural opportunities for positive interactions between Timothy and his classmates. The breakthrough she'd hoped for remained elusive. Timothy's academic performance stayed strong. He consistently scored at the top of the class on assessments and completed assignments with care and creativity. But his social isolation deepened, and Keisha began noticing signs that concerned her even more. Timothy started arriving at school earlier and earlier, as if seeking refuge in the empty classroom. He lingered after dismissal, slowly packing his belongings, as if dreading the transition to whatever awaited him at home or in the after-school program. Most troubling of all, Timothy began displaying physical symptoms that Keisha recognized as stress-related. He complained of stomachaches on days when group projects were scheduled. His usually neat handwriting became shaky during activities that required peer interaction. He started seeking permission to visit the nurse with increasing frequency, particularly during lunch and recess periods when student interactions were less structured. Keisha's frustration was compounded by her awareness of her own limitations within the school system. As a young teacher without tenure, she needed to be careful about how forcefully she advocated for individual students. She'd seen other passionate teachers burn out or lose their positions by pushing too hard against administrative preferences or parent complaints. Yet her conscience wouldn't allow her to simply accept Timothy's suffering as inevitable. The situation came to a head on a rainy October morning that would change everything. Timothy arrived at school visibly upset, though he tried to hide it behind his usual quiet demeanor. His eyes were red-rimmed, and his hands shook slightly as he hung up his jacket. Keisha made a mental note to check on him privately during recess, but the morning's lessons demanded her attention to the entire class. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. During math time, while students worked on problem-solving activities in small groups, Keisha noticed Timothy sitting alone at his desk, ostracized once again from collaborative work. Brandon and his friends had claimed they were already full. When Timothy approached their group, leaving him without partners for the 3rd time that week, The familiar pattern was playing out once more. But something in Timothy's expression suggested this day would be different. What Kaisha couldn't have known was that this seemingly ordinary morning would force her to make a choice that would cost her job but ultimately reveal truths that would transform both her life and Timothy's in ways neither could have imagined. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the Jefferson Elementary playground as students burst through the doors for their final recess of the day. Kaisha Williams stood at her assigned supervision post near the swing sets, her eyes automatically scanning the chaotic scene of children at play. After 6 weeks of school, she had developed an instinct for reading the playground social dynamics, which groups formed naturally, which children gravitates toward solitary activities, and most importantly, where trouble was likely to emerge. Timothy Shun sat alone on a bench near the basketball court, his small frame hunched over a book that seemed too advanced for a third grader. The sight had become familiar to Kaisha, yet it never failed to tug at her heart. While other children ran, laughed, and negotiated the complex social agreements that governed playground politics, Timothy remained in his bubble of isolation, finding refuge in stories that transported him far from Jefferson Elementary's harsh social realities. The October air carried the crisp promise of winter, and most students had adapted their outdoor play to the cooler weather. Soccer games dominated the main field. Jump rope competitions created rhythmic choruses near the building, and the playground equipment buzzed with climbing, swinging children testing their physical boundaries. For many students, recess represented the day's highlight, a break from academic pressure and structured learning that allowed their natural creativity and energy to flourish. Brandon Phillips commanded attention at the center of the basketball court, his athletic ability and natural leadership making him the unofficial coordinator of competitive games. His circle of admirers had grown steadily since the school year began, drawn by his confidence and apparent immunity to adult authority. Brandon possessed the kind of charisma that made other children want to please him, to earn his approval. Through loyalty and participation in whatever activities he deemed worthy. Today, Brandon seemed restless, his usual basketball game failing to hold his interest. Kaisha noticed him glancing repeatedly toward Timothy's bench, his expression suggesting that mischief was brewing. She moved slightly closer, positioning herself where she could intervene quickly if necessary, but not so obviously that her presence would escalate any potential confrontation. The catalyst came in the form of Timothy's dropped pencil. As he shifted position to catch better light for reading, his mechanical pencil, a gift from his mother that he treasured, rolled off the bench and came to rest several feet away. Timothy marked his place in the book carefully and walked over to retrieve it, unaware that his movement had caught Brandon's attention. "Hey guys, look," Brandon called to his friends, his voice carrying that particular tone children used when they'd spotted an opportunity for entertainment at someone else's expense. "Chun's actually moving. I thought maybe he was part of the bench." The comment earned the expected laughs from Brandon's audience, emboldening him to continue. Timothy heard the remark but continued walking toward his pencil, his shoulders tensing almost imperceptibly. Kaisha felt her jaw clench as she recognized the familiar pattern beginning to unfold. Brandon jogged over to where Timothy's pencil lay and picked it up, examining it with exaggerated interest. "Wow, fancy pencil, Chun. Bet this cost like 50 cents at the dollar store." More laughter erupted from his followers, who had begun gathering around the scene with the anticipation of children who sensed drama approaching. Timothy stopped a few feet away, his dark eyes fixed on Brandon's hands. "May I have my pencil back, please?" His voice was quiet but steady, displaying more courage than many adults would have shown in similar circumstances. Brandon tossed the pencil up and caught it, a gesture designed to demonstrate his control over the situation. "I don't know, Chun. You've been sitting over there all alone again. That's not very social. Maybe you should try playing with other kids instead of always reading those weird books." "I like reading," Timothy replied simply. Please give me my pencil." The growing crowd of spectators created a semicircle around the two boys, their excited whispers adding to the tension. Kaisha began walking toward them, but she was still 30 yards away and would need to navigate around several groups of playing children to reach the confrontation. Brandon's demeanor shifted from playful mockery to something harder. "You know what your problem is, Chun? You think you're better than everyone else. Always sitting alone with your books, never talking to anyone. My dad says people like that are weird." Timothy's face flushed, but he maintained his composure. "I don't think I'm better than anyone. I just want my pencil back." "People like what?" The question came from Aisha, one of Kaisha's brightest students who had been jumping rope nearby. Her voice carried genuine curiosity tinged with concern. Brandon seemed to realize he was venturing into territory that might attract unwanted adult attention, but the audience's expectation pushed him forward. "You know, people who don't fit in, who act like they're too good for everyone else." Kaisha was close enough now to hear the conversation clearly, and she quickened her pace. She could see Timothy's hands clenched at his sides, his book clutched against his chest like a shield. The boy was trying desperately to maintain his dignity while being humiliated in front of a growing audience of classmates. "I fit in fine," Timothy said, though his voice wavered slightly. "I just prefer quiet activities," Brandon snorted with derision. "Right. That's why nobody ever talks to you. That's why you eat lunch alone every day. That's enough." Kaisha's voice cut through the playground noise with authority that made several children jump. She had covered the last 10 yards quickly, arriving just as Brandon's taunts were escalating into crueler territory. Brandon's expression immediately shifted to practiced innocence. "Oh hey, Mrs. Williams, we were just talking to Timothy about joining our basketball game. Is that what you were doing?" Kaisha's tone made it clear she hadn't been fooled by his explanation. "It sounded more like you were making fun of him for enjoying books." "No, we weren't making fun," chimed in Derek, one of Brandon's regular followers. "We were just saying he should try playing sports sometimes instead of always reading." Kaisha looked around the circle of faces, reading the mixture of guilt, excitement, and anticipation in their expressions. Some children seemed uncomfortable with what they'd witnessed, while others appeared disappointed that the entertainment had been interrupted. Timothy stood slightly apart from the group, his face a mask of carefully controlled emotion. "Timothy," Kaisha said gently, "are these boys bothering you?" The question hung in the air like a test with no correct answer. Timothy's eyes darted between Kaisha's concerned face and Brandon's warning glare. The social calculus of 3rd grade was complex. Reporting bullying might bring temporary relief, but would guarantee escalated retaliation later. Denying the problem preserved immediate social standing, but left him defenseless against future attacks. "No, Mrs. Williams," Timothy sighed quietly. "They were just asking about my book." Kaisha felt her heart break a little at the obvious lie, recognizing the impossible position Timothy found himself in. She also noticed that Brandon still held the pencil, using it as a prop to maintain control over the situation. "Brandon, please return Timothy's pencil," she said firmly. Brandon's smile was perfectly calibrated to appear cooperative while maintaining his psychological advantage. "Sure thing, Mrs. Williams. Here you go, Chun." He tossed the pencil toward Timothy, but deliberately threw it short so that it landed in the dirt, several feet away. The gesture was designed to look accidental while forcing Timothy to kneel in the dirt to retrieve his possession. Several children giggled at what appeared to be clumsiness, though Kaisha recognized the calculated humiliation behind the action. Timothy walked over to pick up his pencil, brushing dirt from its surface with careful attention. Kaisha watched Brandon's face during this moment and saw something that made her stomach turn: satisfaction at having successfully degraded another child while maintaining plausible deniability. "All right, everyone back to your activities," Kaisha announced, trying to disperse the crowd before the situation could escalate further. Recess will be over in 10 minutes. Most children wandered away, their attention spans already shifting to other interests. Brandon lingered for a moment, his eyes meeting Keisha's with a look that seemed to challenge her authority. She held his gaze steadily until he finally jogged back toward the basketball court, his followers trailing behind him. Timothy had returned to his bench and reopened his book, but Keisha could see that his hands were trembling slightly as he turned the pages. She approached and sat down beside him, maintaining a comfortable distance that wouldn't feel intrusive. "Good. Book?" she asked casually. Timothy glanced up, surprised by her presence. "Yes, ma'am. It's about a boy who discovers he can talk to animals. That sounds fascinating. Is it helping you escape from playground drama?" The question was gentle but direct, giving Timothy permission to acknowledge what had just happened, without forcing him to explicitly report his classmates. He looked at her with eyes that seemed far older than his 8 years. "Sometimes books are easier than people," he said quietly. Keisha felt a rush of protective anger toward the children who had driven this intelligent, sensitive boy to seek refuge in literature. "People can be complicated," she agreed. "But not all of them are mean." Timothy nodded but didn't respond, his attention apparently focused on his book again. Keisha understood that he needed space to process the incident and regain his emotional equilibrium. She stood to continue her supervision duties, but made a mental note to keep closer watch on future interactions between Timothy and Brandon's group. The remainder of recess passed without incident, but Keisha noticed subtle changes in the playgrounds. Social dynamics. Timothy's public humiliation had reinforced existing hierarchies, reminding other children of the social costs associated with befriending him. Several students who might have naturally gravitated toward his quiet intelligence now maintained careful distance, unwilling to risk becoming targets themselves. When the bell rang to signal the end of recess, Keisha watched the children line up for their return to classrooms. Timothy took his usual position at the back of the line, book still clutched in his hands like a talisman. Brandon and his friends clustered near the front, their animated conversation and laughter suggesting that the earlier confrontation had already been transformed into an entertaining story to be retold and embellished. The afternoon's academic activities proceeded normally, but Keisha found herself paying closer attention to the subtle interactions between students. During group work, Timothy was once again excluded from collaborative activities, forced to complete assignments independently, while his classmates enjoyed the social benefits of shared learning. The pattern had become so normalized that most children didn't even notice it happening. As dismissal time approached, Keisha began preparing for her most challenging task of the day, the after-school detention. She would need to serve for what was about to happen. She had made a decision during recess that would cost her dearly, but she could no longer stand by and watch Timothy's systematic destruction continue unchecked. Principal Richardson had called an emergency faculty meeting immediately after school, which meant Keisha would need to act quickly if she was going to intervene in the situation that had been building all day. She waited until most students had been dismissed, then approached Brandon as he gathered his belongings. "Brandon, I need to speak with you privately," she said in a tone that brooked no argument. Brandon's confident demeanor faltered slightly, but he followed her to the hallway outside the classroom. Keisha closed the door behind them and turned to face him with an expression of serious concern. "I want to talk about what happened on the playground today," she began. "Mrs. Williams, I already told you we weren't doing anything wrong," Brandon replied, his voice taking on the practiced innocence that children mastered when confronting adult authority. "Brandon, I've been teaching for several years, and I've learned to recognize bullying when I see it. What you did to Timothy today was cruel and deliberate." Brandon's face reddened, but whether from embarrassment or anger was difficult to determine. "He's weird, Mrs. Williams. He never talks to anyone. He just sits there reading all the time. The other kids think he's stuck up. Being quiet doesn't make someone weird, Brandon. And even if Timothy were different, that wouldn't give you the right to humiliate him in front of other children. I wasn't humiliating him, Brandon protested. I was just trying to get him to play with us instead of always being alone. Kaisha felt her patience wearing thin with Brandon's refusal to acknowledge his behavior. By taking his pencil? By making jokes about his appearance? By forcing him to pick his belongings up from the dirt? That was an accident, Brandon said. Quickly, I didn't mean to throw it short. Brandon, look at me. Kaisha's voice carried the authority of someone who would not be dismissed or manipulated. I know what I saw today, and I know what I've been seeing for weeks. You've been systematically excluding Timothy from activities, encouraging other children to avoid him, and making fun of him whenever you think adults aren't watching. Brandon's composure began to crack under Kaisha's direct confrontation. He doesn't want to be friends anyway. He acts like he's too good for us. Have you ever actually tried to include him in something he might enjoy? Have you ever asked about his interests or invited him to join activities that don't require athletic ability? The question seemed to genuinely puzzle Brandon, as if the concept of accommodating someone else's preferences had never occurred to him. But he likes weird stuff, books and math and science. That's not fun. It's fun to Timothy, Kaisha pointed out. And there are probably other children in our class who would enjoy those activities too, but they're afraid to say so because they don't want to be treated the way you treat Timothy. Brandon fell silent, perhaps beginning to understand the broader implications of his behavior. Kaisha pressed her advantage, hoping to create a teachable moment that might prevent future incidents. Brandon, you're a natural leader. Other children look up to you and follow your example. That gives you power, but it also gives you responsibility. You can use your influence to make school a better place for everyone, or you can use it to make some children miserable. I'm not trying to make anyone miserable, Brandon mumbled, his earlier defiance replaced by something that might have been genuine remorse. Maybe not intentionally, Kaisha acknowledged. But impact matters more than intent. Timothy goes home every day feeling lonely and rejected because of how he's treated at school. That's not the kind of leader I hope you'll choose to be. The conversation was interrupted by Principal Richardson's voice over the intercom, announcing that the faculty meeting would begin in 5 minutes. Kaisha realized she was out of time for the gentle intervention she had hoped to conduct. We'll continue this conversation tomorrow, she told Brandon. I want you to think tonight about what kind of person you want to be and what kind of classroom community you want to help create. Brandon nodded and hurried away, clearly eager to escape further uncomfortable scrutiny. Kaisha watched him go, hoping that their conversation might plant seeds of empathy that would eventually grow into better behavior. What she didn't realize was that Brandon would go home that evening and complain to his parents about being unfairly accused by his teacher, setting in motion a chain of events that would soon force Kaisha to make an even more difficult choice about how far she was willing to go to protect a vulnerable child. The morning air felt different when Kaisha arrived at Jefferson Elementary. The next day, the custodial staff was already preparing for another busy day of learning. But something in the atmosphere seemed charged with tension that had nothing to do with the approaching storm. Clouds gathering over Richmond. Kaisha had spent a restless night replaying her conversation with Brandon, wondering if she had pushed too hard or not hard enough in addressing his treatment of Timothy. Her concerns proved justified when she found a pink slip in her mailbox, requesting her immediate presence in Principal Richardson's office before the first period. The formal summons sent a chill down her spine. In her 3 years of teaching, she had never been called to the principal's office for anything more serious than scheduling conflicts or supply requests. Principal Richardson's office reflected the no-nonsense approach she brought to school administration. Metal filing cabinets lined the walls, filled with the endless documentation required by state education departments. A large calendar dominated one wall, marked with testing dates, professional development requirements, and budget deadlines. Richardson herself sat behind a desk that had seen decades of difficult conversations, her expression unreadable as Keisha knocked on the partially open door. "Come in, Keisha. Please close the door behind you." The request to close the door confirmed Keisha's suspicions that this meeting would not be routine. She settled into the uncomfortable plastic chair across from Richardson's desk, noting the presence of what appeared to be official correspondence spread across the principal's workspace. Richardson removed her reading glasses and studied Keisha with the tired expression of someone who had dealt with too many personnel issues over her 20-year career. "I received a very concerning phone call last night from Donald Phillips. He's quite upset about your interaction with his son Brandon yesterday afternoon." Keisha felt her stomach drop, but she maintained her composure. "I spoke with Brandon about his behavior toward another student on the playground. It was a necessary conversation about bullying and the classroom climate. According to Mr. Phillips, you accused his son of being a bully without any evidence, embarrassed him in front of other children, and made him feel targeted because of his family's position in the community." The accusation was so far from reality that Keisha almost laughed, but she recognized the serious tone of Richardson's voice and the potential implications of this complaint. "That's not what happened at all. I witnessed Brandon humiliating Timothy Chun during recess, and I addressed it privately with Brandon afterward. There were no other children present during our conversation." Richardson consulted the notes she had apparently taken during her phone conversation with Mr. Phillips. "He says you've been singling out Brandon for weeks, watching him constantly, and creating a hostile environment in your classroom." "I've been watching Brandon because he's been systematically bullying Timothy Chun since the school year began," Keisha replied, her voice rising slightly with frustration. "I documented my concerns and reported them through proper channels. Timothy is being isolated, humiliated, and excluded by Brandon and his friends on a daily basis. Do you have documentation of these alleged incidents?" The question revealed the fundamental problem with addressing subtle bullying. Most incidents were designed to be deniable, leaving vulnerable children without recourse and protective adults without evidence. The bullying is primarily social exclusion and verbal harassment that stops whenever adults approach. Timothy is too intimidated to report specific incidents, which is exactly why Brandon's behavior is so effective. Richardson leaned back in her chair, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. "Keisha, I understand your concern for all students, but Mr. Phillips is questioning your judgment and professionalism. He's suggesting that you might have personal biases that are affecting your treatment of his son." The implication hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Keisha understood immediately what personal biases meant in this context. The suggestion that her race influenced her perception of Brandon's behavior, that she was somehow predisposed to see prejudice where none existed. "My only bias is toward protecting vulnerable students from harassment," Keisha said carefully. "Timothy Chun is being systematically excluded and humiliated, and I have a professional obligation to address that situation. Mr. Phillips doesn't see it that way. He believes his son was trying to include Timothy in playground activities, and that you misinterpreted normal childhood interactions as something more sinister." Keisha realized she was facing an impossible situation. Brandon's family had resources, connections, and social capital that allowed them to reframe the narrative in their favor. Timothy's family, by contrast, was quiet, unconnected, and unlikely to advocate forcefully for their son's rights. "Have you spoken with Mrs. Chun about Timothy's experiences at school?" Keisha asked. Richardson shuffled through papers on her desk, avoiding eye contact. "Mrs. Chun works multiple jobs and is difficult to reach during school hours. When we have contacted her about Timothy's adjustment challenges, she's been cooperative but hasn't reported any specific concerns about bullying. Timothy Doesn't tell his mother about the bullying because he doesn't want to worry her. He's protecting her from additional stress because he can see how hard she's working to support their family. That's speculation, Kaisha. What we know for certain is that a prominent family is questioning your professional judgment and requesting that their son be removed from your classroom. The threat was clear. Brandon's family had enough influence to force administrative action, while Timothy's family lacked the social capital to defend themselves or their teacher. Kaisha found herself at the center of a conflict that extended far beyond classroom management into issues of power, privilege, and institutional politics. What exactly is Mr. Phillips requesting? Kaisha asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. He wants Brandon transferred to Mrs. Patterson's class, and he's asking for a formal investigation into your classroom management practices. The request was designed to be punitive while appearing reasonable. Moving Brandon would remove him from accountability while leaving Timothy vulnerable to other students who had learned from Brandon's example. An investigation into Kaisha's practices would create a cloud of suspicion that could follow her throughout her career. And what happens to Timothy while we're protecting Brandon from accountability for his behavior? Richardson's expression softened slightly, revealing the frustration she felt with the impossible position her job often created. Timothy will continue to receive the same quality education as every other student. You'll need to ensure that your classroom management approach doesn't create the appearance of favoritism toward any particular student. The coded language was clear. Kaisha was being warned to stop advocating for Timothy if she wanted to preserve her own position. The message represented everything wrong with institutional priorities that valued avoiding conflict over protecting vulnerable children. I won't stop advocating for students who need support, Kaisha said firmly. That's not favoritism, it's professional responsibility. Richardson removed her glasses and rubbed her temples, clearly exhausted by the political dimensions of what should have been a straightforward disciplinary matter. Kaisha, I admire your dedication to student welfare, but you need to understand the realities of public education. We depend on community support, parent volunteers, and family contributions to maintain our programs. We can't afford to alienate influential families over what might be normal childhood conflicts. Normal childhood conflicts don't involve systematic social exclusion designed to humiliate vulnerable students, Kaisha replied. What's happening to Timothy goes far beyond normal peer disagreements. Perhaps. But perception matters more than reality in situations like this. Mr. Phillips has connections to the school board, contributes generously to school fundraisers, and has the ear of other influential families. If he decides to make this a larger issue, it could have consequences that extend far beyond your classroom. Kaisha understood the subtext. Her job security was being weighed against the comfort of a wealthy family, and the scales were not balanced in her favor. The conversation was simultaneously a warning and a threat, delivered with the kind of bureaucratic politeness that made resistance seem unreasonable. What would you have me do differently? Kaisha asked, genuinely curious about how her principal expected her to handle future situations. Document everything more carefully. Involve parents earlier in the process. Ensure that any disciplinary conversations include witnesses or occur in more formal settings. And perhaps most importantly, remember that your perception of events might not be the only valid interpretation. The suggestion that her professional judgment was fundamentally unreliable stung more than direct criticism would have. Richardson was essentially telling her to doubt her own observations and defer to families with more social influence, regardless of the impact on vulnerable students. I'll take your guidance under consideration, Kaisha said, using the same diplomatic language that educators employed when they disagreed with administrative directives but couldn't openly challenge them. I hope you will. And Kaisha, I need to be clear about something else. Mr. Phillips has requested that any future incidents involving Brandon be handled exclusively by administration rather than addressed by you directly. I'm not comfortable with that level of micromanagement, but I need your assurance that you'll involve me immediately if any situations arise. The directive effectively removed Kaisha's ability to address Brandon's behavior in real time, creating a reporting structure that would slow responses and reduce accountability. By the time incidents could be properly documented and escalated through administrative channels, their impact on Timothy would already be complete. I understand, Kaisha said, though understanding and agreeing were entirely different things. Good. I'm going to call Mr. Phillips this afternoon and let him know that we've discussed his concerns and that you're committed to maintaining professional standards in your classroom management. The meeting was clearly over, but Kaisha couldn't resist one final attempt to refocus attention on the student who actually needed protection. What about Timothy? What support will we provide to help him feel safe and included in our school? Community? Richardson's pause suggested she hadn't considered Timothy's needs beyond ensuring that his presence didn't create additional administrative burdens. Timothy is performing well academically, which suggests that any social challenges he's experiencing aren't significantly impacting his educational progress. We'll continue to monitor the situation. The response perfectly encapsulated the institutional blindness that allowed bullying to flourish. Academic performance was treated as the only meaningful measure of student well-being, while social-emotional development was relegated to secondary importance unless it created obvious disruptions. Kaisha left the principal's office feeling like she had been simultaneously defeated and energized. The administrative response to Brandon's bullying was predictable but still disappointing, reflecting systemic priorities that valued maintaining relationships with influential families over protecting vulnerable children. Yet the conversation had also clarified the stakes involved and strengthened her resolve to find more creative ways to support Timothy. The first period bell was ringing. As Kaisha returned to her classroom, where students were already settling into their morning routines, Timothy sat at his desk with characteristic quiet dignity, unaware that his teacher had just been warned against advocating too forcefully for his welfare. Brandon entered with his usual confident stride, perhaps sensing that the balance of power had shifted in his favor, but not yet understanding how completely. During morning announcements, Kaisha found herself studying the faces of her students with new awareness of the complex dynamics that shaped their daily experiences. Timothy's isolation was visible to anyone who cared to look, but institutional structures made addressing it increasingly difficult. Brandon's influence over other students was subtle but powerful, creating ripple effects that extended far beyond their direct interactions. The day's lessons proceeded normally, but Kaisha felt like she was operating under surveillance. Every interaction with Brandon carried the weight of administrative scrutiny, while every gesture of support toward Timothy risked being interpreted as favoritism. The environment that should have felt safe and creative for both teaching and learning had become charged with political tension. During lunch, Kaisha watched Timothy eat alone while Brandon's table buzzed with animated conversation and laughter. The contrast was stark and heartbreaking, yet intervening would now require navigating layers of administrative approval that would make meaningful support nearly impossible. What Kaisha didn't know was that Timothy's mother had received her own phone call the previous evening, not from school administration, but from someone claiming to represent community interests, who suggested that her son might be happier in a different educational environment. The pressure was building from multiple directions, and the final confrontation that would cost Kaisha her job was just hours away. The November afternoon felt heavy with unspoken tension as students filed into Kaisha Williams' classroom after lunch. 2 weeks had passed since her meeting with Principal Richardson, and the atmosphere at Jefferson Elementary had shifted in subtle but significant ways. Kaisha moved through her daily routines with heightened awareness, knowing that every interaction was potentially being scrutinized by parents and administrators, who were watching for any sign of the favoritism she'd been accused of showing Timothy. Shun entered the classroom with his usual quiet dignity, but Kaisha noticed changes in him that concerned her deeply. His shoulders seemed more hunched than before. His eyes rarely left his desk during group activities, and he had begun arriving at school later and later each morning, as if dreading the day ahead. The social isolation that had been painful but manageable was evolving into something that looked dangerously close to depression. Brandon Phillips, meanwhile, had grown bolder in his treatment of Timothy, emboldened by the knowledge that his father's complaint had effectively shielded him from direct teacher intervention. His tactics had become more sophisticated, never quite crossing lines that would trigger obvious disciplinary action, but creating a constant atmosphere of exclusion and subtle humiliation that was wearing Timothy down day by day. The catalyst for the day's crisis began during science class, when Kaisha announced that students would be working in pairs to conduct an experiment about plant growth. Partnership selection in 3rd grade was always fraught with social dynamics, but today the process carried additional weight because Timothy had been systematically excluded from collaborative work for weeks. Please find a partner and collect your materials from the supply table, Kaisha instructed, watching carefully as students began the familiar dance of pairing off. As expected, Timothy remained seated at his desk while classmates formed partnerships around him, their movements careful and deliberate in avoiding any suggestion that they might include him. Kaisha waited until most pairs had formed before intervening. Timothy, would you like to work with Aisha today? I notice her partner is absent. Asisha looked up from her science notebook with an expression of mild panic. She was a kind child who probably would have naturally included Timothy under normal circumstances, but weeks of social conditioning had taught her that befriending him carried social risks she wasn't prepared to take. Actually, Mrs. Williams, Brandon's voice cut through the classroom with practiced innocence, Aisha was going to work with me and Derek as a group of 3. We already started planning our experiment. The statement wasn't technically a lie, but it was designed to block Timothy's inclusion while maintaining plausible deniability. Kaisha felt her jaw clench as she recognized the calculated nature of Brandon's interference, but she also understood that challenging him directly would likely result in another complaint to administration. Science experiments work best with partners, Kaisha replied diplomatically. Groups of 3 tend to leave one person without hands-on involvement. But we already made our plans, Derek chimed in, supporting Brandon's narrative. It would be confusing to change now. Kaisha looked around the classroom, noting that every other student was already paired or grouped, leaving Timothy as the only child without a partner. The situation was both heartbreaking and infuriating. A 9-year-old boy was being systematically excluded from learning activities while adults were constrained from intervening by political considerations. Timothy, you can be my partner today, Kaisha said, making a decision that would later be characterized as inappropriate favoritism. We'll set up our experiment at the demonstration table. The announcement created a ripple of whispered comments throughout the classroom. Some students seemed relieved that the awkward situation had been resolved, while others exchanged glances that suggested this development would be reported and discussed. Beyond school hours, Timothy's face showed a mixture of gratitude and embarrassment. As he gathered his materials and joined Kaisha at the front demonstration table, she could see in his eyes that he understood the social cost of being rescued by the teacher, but also his relief at not having to endure another day of exclusion. Okay, everyone, let's begin by examining our seeds and making predictions about growth patterns, Kaisha announced, trying to normalize the situation and redirect attention to the lesson content. The science experiment proceeded smoothly for the first 20 minutes, with students engaged in measuring soil, planting seeds, and recording observations. Timothy worked quietly beside Kaisha, his natural curiosity about scientific processes temporarily overriding his social anxiety. For a brief moment, the classroom felt like the inclusive learning environment Kaisha had always envisioned. turning point came when Timothy accidentally knocked over a small container of water while reaching for his notebook. The spill was minor, barely a tablespoon of water that was easily contained with paper towels. But Brandon seized the moment as an opportunity to reassert his social dominance. "Nice going, Chun," Brandon called out with exaggerated exasperation. "Now everyone's going to have to wait while you clean up your mess." Several students laughed at Brandon's comment, not because it was particularly clever, but because they had learned that supporting his mockery was socially rewarding while defending. Timothy carried risks. The laughter felt like physical blows to Timothy, whose face flushed with humiliation as he hurried to clean up the small spill. "It was just an accident," Kaisha said firmly, addressing the entire class. "Accidents happen to everyone, and we help each other clean up without making anyone feel bad about honest mistakes." "I was just saying what everyone was thinking," Brandon replied with a shrug that suggested he was merely being honest rather than cruel. Kaisha felt something snap inside her as she watched Timothy's shoulders shake with suppressed emotion. 3 months of systematic harassment, 2 weeks of administrative constraints, and countless moments of small cruelties had built to this breaking point, where a child was being humiliated for a minor accident while adults were expected to maintain polite neutrality. "Brandon, step into the hallway with me," Kaisha said, her voice carrying a finality that made several students look up with anticipation. Brandon's confident expression faltered slightly as he recognized that he might have pushed too far. "Mrs. Williams, I was just hallway, now." The tone brooked no argument, and Brandon reluctantly followed Kaisha outside the classroom. She closed the door behind them and turned to face him with an expression of controlled fury that he had never seen from any adult. "What you just did to Timothy was cruel and unnecessary," she began, her voice low but intense. "Making fun of a child for an accident is not being honest, it's being a bully." "I wasn't being mean," Brandon protested, but his usual confidence was wavering under Kaisha's direct confrontation. "I was just pointing out what happened. You were publicly humiliating a classmate who has never done anything to hurt you. You've spent months making Timothy's life miserable, and I'm not going to stand by and watch it continue." Brandon's face reddened with a mixture of embarrassment and anger. "You can't talk to me like that. My dad said you're not allowed to accuse me of things without proof." "I don't need your father's permission to address your behavior when I witness it directly," Kaisha replied. "And what I witnessed was a deliberate attempt to embarrass Timothy in front of the entire class." "He's weird," Brandon said, abandoning his pretense of innocence. "Nobody likes him because he's weird and different and thinks he's better than everyone else. Timothy has never said or done anything to suggest he thinks he's better than anyone. He's quiet, he likes to read, and he's kind to everyone despite how terribly he's been treated. Well, maybe if he tried to be normal instead of sitting alone all the time reading stupid books." "Stop." Kaisha's voice cut through Brandon's justification with absolute authority. "Listen to me very carefully, Brandon. Timothy doesn't need to change who he is to deserve basic kindness and respect. He doesn't need to pretend to like things he doesn't enjoy just to avoid being tormented by classmates." Brandon stared at her with an expression of shock, as if the concept that Timothy had a right to be different had never occurred to him. "Every child in my classroom deserves to feel safe and included, regardless of their personality, interests, or background. What you've been doing to Timothy is not normal childhood behavior. It's systematic harassment designed to make him feel worthless." "I never said he was worthless," Brandon mumbled, perhaps beginning to understand the weight of his actions. "You didn't need to say it. Your behavior has been saying it for months. Do you have any idea how Timothy feels when he comes to school every day, knowing that his classmates have decided he doesn't deserve friendship or basic courtesy?" The question seemed to genuinely puzzle Brandon, suggesting that he had never considered Timothy's emotional experience as relevant to his own behavior. The empathy gap was stunning. Brandon had spent months systematically excluding and humiliating a classmate without ever considering the human cost of his actions. I want you to think about something, Kaisha continued. Imagine if you came to school every day and no one wanted to sit with you at lunch. No one picked you for teams. No one included you in conversations. And people made fun of things you cared about. How would that feel? Brandon shifted uncomfortably, clearly struggling with the concept of experiencing the treatment he had been inflicting on Timothy. But I'm not weird like he is. Timothy isn't weird, Brandon. He's different from you, but different doesn't mean wrong or bad or deserving of cruelty. Some people are athletic, some are artistic, some love books, some love sports. The world is better because people have different interests and talents. But kids like him don't fit in, Brandon said, revealing the core belief that had justified his behavior. They make everyone else uncomfortable. Timothy makes you uncomfortable because he reminds you that there are different ways to be smart, different ways to find happiness, different ways to exist in the world. Instead of trying to destroy those differences, you could learn from them. The conversation was interrupted by Principal Richardson's voice calling Kaisha's name from down the hallway. Both teacher and student turned to see the principal approaching, with an expression of concern that suggested she had received another complaint. "Mrs. Williams, I need to speak with you immediately," Richardson said, her tone carrying the formal distance that indicated serious trouble. "Brandon, please return to your classroom." Brandon hurried away, leaving Kaisha alone with her principal in the echoing hallway. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows that seemed to symbolize the impossible choices that defined public education. "I just received a phone call from Mr. Phillips," Richardson began without preamble. "He's received reports that you're continuing to target Brandon despite our previous conversation." Kaisha felt a cold knot form in her stomach as she realized that her intervention had been anticipated and reported, likely by students who had been coached to watch for any signs of unfair treatment toward Brandon. "I addressed Brandon's behavior after he publicly humiliated Timothy during our science lesson," Kaisha said carefully. "It was a necessary response to classroom disruption. According to the reports I received, you singled Brandon out for normal peer interaction and subjected him to an inappropriate lecture about bullying. The distortion of reality was breathtaking. Brandon's calculated cruelty had been reframed as normal peer interaction, while Kaisha's attempt to address it was characterized as inappropriate targeting. Timothy spilled a small amount of water by accident, and Brandon made fun of him in front of the entire class. That's not normal peer interaction, it's deliberate humiliation of a vulnerable student." Richardson removed her glasses and rubbed her temples with the weary gesture of someone who had been placed in an impossible position. "Kaisha, I'm going to be very direct with you. Mr. Phillips is demanding your immediate termination. He's prepared to take this to the school board, if necessary." The threat was clear and immediate. Kaisha's job was hanging by a thread, dependent on her willingness to abandon Timothy to his tormentors in exchange for preserving her own position. "And what happens to Timothy while we're protecting Brandon from accountability?" Kaisha asked, echoing her question from their previous meeting. "Timothy will receive the same educational opportunities as every other student," Richardson replied with bureaucratic precision. "But Kaisha, I need you to understand something. If you continue down this path, you won't be here to help any students. Sometimes protecting your ability to make a difference requires choosing your battles more carefully." The logic was seductive but fundamentally flawed. Preserving her position by abandoning vulnerable students would transform her from an educator into an enabler of institutional cruelty. The choice was becoming clear, even if the consequences were terrifying. "I became a teacher to protect children like Timothy," Kaisha said quietly. "If I can't do that, then maybe I shouldn't be teaching." Richardson's expression softened with what might have been respect, mixed with pity. "Don't make any decisions. while you're emotional. Take the weekend to think about this situation and what's best for everyone involved. But Kaisha had already made her decision. She would not abandon Timothy to preserve her own position, regardless of the cost. What she didn't know was that Timothy's mother was about to make an appearance that would change everything both of them thought they knew about power, influence, and the true meaning of protection. The weekend following Kaisha's confrontation with Principal Richardson passed in a blur of sleepless nights and anxious deliberation. She spent Saturday morning grading papers at her small kitchen table, but her mind kept drifting to Timothy's face when Brandon had humiliated him over the spilled water. By Sunday evening, she had made peace with the likelihood that Monday would bring her termination letter. Some principals, she had decided, were worth more than job security. Monday morning arrived with an unusual energy at Jefferson Elementary. Word had spread through the parent network about the situation in Mrs. Williams' classroom, and various factions had begun forming around different interpretations of events. Some parents supported Kaisha's efforts to address bullying, while others viewed her actions as evidence of bias against successful families. The school had become a microcosm of larger societal tensions about race, class, and institutional power. Kaisha arrived early, as was her custom, but found Principal Richardson waiting in her classroom with an expression that suggested significant developments had occurred over the weekend. The principal held a manila folder that appeared to contain official documentation, and her demeanor carried the formal distance that typically preceded difficult personnel decisions. "Good morning, Kaisha," Richardson said, her tone carefully neutral. "We need to discuss some developments that occurred over the weekend." Kaisha set down her bag and faced her principal with the calm dignity she had cultivated during 3 years of navigating educational bureaucracy. "What kind of developments?" "Mr. Phillips contacted the school board directly on Friday evening. He's filed a formal complaint alleging discrimination and requesting your immediate removal from the classroom." The escalation wasn't surprising, but hearing it articulated so bluntly still felt like a physical blow. Kaisha had expected consequences for her actions, but the speed and severity of the response demonstrated just how much influence Brandon's family wielded within the district. "I see," Kaisha replied evenly. "And what is the school board's response?" Richardson opened the manila folder and consulted documents that appeared to be official correspondence. "They've ordered a formal investigation into your classroom management practices and your interactions with the Phillips family. Pending the outcome of that investigation, you're being placed on administrative leave effective immediately." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Administrative leave was typically the first step toward termination, especially in cases involving parent complaints and allegations of discrimination. Kaisha felt 3 years of dedicated teaching and countless hours of unpaid overtime being erased by a single family's determination to protect their child from accountability. "How long will the investigation take?" Kaisha asked, though she suspected the answer would be academic. These processes typically require several weeks to complete properly. The board wants to ensure that all parties have opportunities to present their perspectives and that any decisions are based on thorough documentation. The bureaucratic language masked a simpler reality. Kaisha's career at Jefferson Elementary was effectively over. The investigation would likely conclude that while her intentions were good, her methods were inappropriate, and her judgment was questionable. The district would express regret while emphasizing their commitment to serving all families fairly. "What happens to my students during this investigation?" Kaisha asked, her concern immediately shifting to the children who would be most affected by her absence. "Mrs. Patterson will take over your classroom temporarily. She's an experienced substitute who has worked with our district for several years." Kaisha nodded, though her heart ached thinking about Timothy facing this transition without any explanation or support. The boy was already struggling with social isolation, and now he would lose the one adult in the building who had consistently advocated for his welfare. Will I have an opportunity to say goodbye to my students and explain the transition? Richardson's expression softened slightly, revealing the personal discomfort she felt with the situation. I'm afraid not. The board's directive is that you need to gather your personal belongings and leave the premises immediately. We don't want to create additional classroom disruption. The cruelty of being denied closure with her students added insult to the professional. Injury. Keisha had spent months building relationships with these children, understanding their individual needs, and creating a classroom environment where learning felt safe and joyful. Now she was being escorted out like a security threat, with no opportunity to explain or reassure the students who had come to trust her. I'll need about 30 minutes to collect my things, Keisha said, maintaining her composure despite the emotional turmoil she felt building inside. Of course. I'll wait outside while you gather your belongings. Richardson left the classroom, closing the door behind her with unusual gentleness. Keisha stood alone in the space that had been her professional home for 3 years, surrounded by evidence of her dedication to student learning and development. Colorful bulletin boards displayed student artwork, inspirational posters encouraged academic risk-taking, and carefully organized learning centers reflected hundreds of hours of preparation and planning. She began packing her personal items mechanically. Family photos, teaching resources she had purchased with her own money, books that had helped her navigate challenging classroom situations. Each item represented investments of time, energy, and money that she had made gladly because she believed in the transformative power of education. The hardest items to pack were the cards and letters students had given her over the years. Thank you. Notes from parents, holiday cards with children's artwork, and small gifts that represented genuine appreciation for her efforts. These mementos had sustained her through difficult days and reminded her why teaching mattered despite its challenges. As she emptied her desk drawers, Keisha found the folder where she had been documenting Timothy's experiences with bullying. Incident reports, behavioral observations, and communication attempts with his mother filled several pages with evidence of systematic harassment that had been dismissed as normal childhood interactions. The documentation felt both vindicated and useless proof that she had been right about Timothy's situation, but insufficient to protect either of them from institutional indifference. The classroom door opened quietly, and Keisha looked up expecting to see Principal Richardson checking on her progress. Instead, Timothy Chun stood in the doorway, his dark eyes wide with confusion and concern. He had arrived early for school, as was his habit, and had apparently seen through the window that something unusual was happening in his classroom. Mrs. Williams? Timothy's voice was barely above a whisper. Why are you putting everything in boxes? Keisha felt her heart break as she looked at this vulnerable child, who had no idea that his defender was being removed from his life. She knelt down to Timothy's eye level, searching for words that could explain an inexplicable situation without adding to his burden of fear and isolation. Timothy, I need to leave Jefferson Elementary for a while, she said gently. Mrs. Patterson is going to be your teacher while I'm away. Timothy's face went pale as he processed this information. Are you leaving because of what happened with Brandon? Because I spilled the water? The question revealed how clearly Timothy understood the connection between his harassment and his teacher's sudden departure. Despite his young age, he recognized that adult decisions about his welfare were being made by people who prioritized other considerations over his protection. You didn't do anything wrong, Timothy, Keisha said firmly. The water spilling was an accident, and accidents are never anyone's fault. But Brandon was mean about it, and then you got in trouble for helping me. Timothy replied with the devastating clarity that children sometimes possessed about adult hypocrisies. Keisha struggled to find age-appropriate language to explain institutional politics and systemic inequities to a 9-year-old boy. Sometimes adults disagree about the best ways to help children. That doesn't mean you're not worthy of help or that you did anything wrong. Timothy's eyes filled with tears that he tried desperately to blink away. "Is Mrs. Patterson going to help me like you did?" The question was heartbreaking because Keisha couldn't honestly promise that Timothy would receive the same level of support from a substitute teacher who didn't know his situation and who would be under pressure to avoid any controversies that might affect her own employment prospects. "Mrs. Patterson is a good teacher who cares about all her students," Keisha said carefully. "But Timothy, I need you to remember something very important." Timothy nodded solemnly, giving her his complete attention. "You are smart, kind, and valuable, exactly as you are. You don't need to change yourself to deserve friendship and respect. Anyone who tells you differently is wrong." "But what if kids keep being mean to me?" Timothy asked, voicing the fear that Keisha knew would haunt him long after she was gone. "Then you remember that their meanness says something about them, not about you. And you keep being kind and smart and curious, because those are your superpowers." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of footsteps in the hallway. Principal Richardson's voice could be heard approaching, along with another voice that Keisha didn't immediately recognize. Timothy heard them too and instinctively moved closer to Keisha, seeking comfort from the adult who had been his protector. "Timothy, you should probably head to the library until your new teacher arrives," Keisha suggested, not wanting him to witness whatever administrative process was about to unfold. "I don't want you to leave," Timothy said quietly, his usual reserve breaking. Down in the face of losing his one advocate. "I don't want to leave either," Keisha admitted, pulling him into a brief hug that violated professional protocols but honored human decency. "But I'm proud of you, and I believe you're going to be okay." Timothy nodded reluctantly and began walking toward the door, but paused and turned back one final time. "Mrs. Williams, thank you for seeing me." The simple statement contained more gratitude and understanding than most adults expressed in entire speeches. Timothy had recognized that Keisha's greatest gift to him wasn't protection from bullying, but acknowledgement of his worth as a human being deserving of dignity and respect. As Timothy left the classroom, the approaching footsteps grew closer. Keisha finished packing her final box and steeled herself for whatever bureaucratic procedures awaited. The door opened to reveal Principal Richardson, accompanied by a woman Keisha had never seen before, an elegantly dressed Asian woman in her 40s whose presence commanded immediate attention. "Keisha, this is Dr. Sarah Chun," Richardson said, her voice carrying an unusual note of nervous deference. "Dr. Chun is Timothy's mother, and she's requested a meeting with you before you leave the building." The introduction sent shockwaves through Keisha's understanding of Timothy's family situation. This composed, professionally dressed woman bore little resemblance to the hurried, overwhelmed single mother Keisha had imagined based on brief encounters. During pickup and drop-off times, Dr. Chun stepped forward with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to commanding respect in professional settings. "Ms. Williams, I apologize for arriving unannounced, but I only learned about the situation this morning when Timothy called me from the school phone." "Timothy called you?" Keisha asked, surprised that the quiet boy had taken such initiative. "He was concerned that you were being punished for protecting him," Dr. Chun replied, her voice carrying subtle steel beneath professional courtesy. "He wanted me to know that you were the only teacher who had ever stood up for him." Richardson shifted uncomfortably beside them, clearly uncertain about how this unexpected parental involvement might affect the carefully orchestrated personnel decision she had been implementing. "Dr. Chun, as I explained on the phone, this situation involves complex personnel matters that are best handled through official channels," Richardson said diplomatically. Dr. Chun turned to face the principal with an expression that suggested she was accustomed to cutting through bureaucratic deflection. "Principal Richardson, what I find complex is how a teacher who advocates for a vulnerable student faces termination while the perpetrators of systematic harassment face no consequences whatsoever." The statement was delivered with calm precision, but its implications were unmistakable. Dr. Chun was not the quiet, overwhelmed single mother that the school administration had assumed her to be, and she was prepared to challenge their handling of both Timothy's situation and Kaisha's dismissal. "I understand your concern for Timothy's welfare," Richardson replied carefully, "but personnel decisions must be based on professional conduct standards rather than family preferences." "I agree completely," Dr. Chun said with a slight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Which is why I'm particularly interested in understanding how professional conduct standards led to punishing the only adult who addressed my son's harassment, while protecting the children who perpetrated it." Kaisha watched this exchange with growing amazement, realizing that Timothy's mother possessed both the intelligence and the confidence to challenge institutional decisions in ways that most parents couldn't or wouldn't attempt. The quiet woman who had seemed overwhelmed during parent conferences was revealing herself to be someone entirely different. "Perhaps we should continue this conversation in my office," Richardson suggested, clearly hoping to move the discussion away from Kaisha's presence. "Actually," Dr. Chen replied, "I think Ms. Williams should be part of any conversation about her employment status, particularly since it directly relates to her advocacy for my son." The dynamic in the room had shifted dramatically. Principal Richardson, who had been confidently implementing a predetermined decision, now found herself defending that decision to a parent who clearly possessed the knowledge and influence to challenge it effectively. What none of them knew was that Dr. Chun's true identity would soon transform this entire situation in ways that would shock everyone at Jefferson Elementary and create opportunities that neither Kaisha nor Timothy could have imagined. The tension in Kaisha's former classroom was palpable as Dr. Sarah Chun faced Principal Richardson with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to wielding authority. Richardson's nervous energy suggested she was beginning to sense that this conversation would not proceed according to her carefully planned script for Kaisha's departure. "Dr. Chun, I appreciate your concern for Timothy's educational experience," Richardson began, employing the diplomatic tone she reserved for potentially difficult parents. "However, the decision regarding Ms. Williams' employment status has been made at the district level, and it's not subject to individual parent input." Dr. Chun's expression remained calm, but something in her posture shifted almost imperceptibly. "District level, you said? That's interesting, because I don't recall seeing any documentation about this case cross my desk." The comment seemed oddly specific, causing Richardson to pause mid-response. "I'm not sure what you mean about your desk, Dr. Chun. Parent feedback typically goes through different channels than Principal Richardson." Dr. Chun interrupted gently. "I think there's been a significant misunderstanding about who I am and what authority I have in this situation." Kaisha watched the exchange with growing confusion, noting the subtle power dynamics that seemed to be shifting by the moment. Dr. Chun's language carried implications that went beyond typical parent advocacy, suggesting access to information and decision-making processes that most families wouldn't possess. Richardson's face showed the first signs of genuine uncertainty. "I'm not sure I understand what you're suggesting, Dr. Chun. What I'm suggesting is that you might want to verify my identity with the district office before proceeding with any irreversible personnel decisions," Dr. Chun replied, reaching into her briefcase to extract what appeared to be official documentation. She handed Richardson a business card that caused the principal's face to drain of color as she read it. Richardson looked up at Dr. Chun, then back at the card, then up again with an expression of dawning horror. "Dr. Sarah Chun, Chief Executive Officer, Richmond Public School District." Richardson read aloud, her voice barely above a whisper. The revelation hit the room like a physical force. Kaisha felt her knees go weak as she processed the implications of what she had just heard. Timothy's quiet, seemingly overwhelmed mother was actually the head of the entire school district, the person ultimately responsible for every policy Every budget decision and every personnel matter across dozens of schools. That's correct, Dr. Chun confirmed with understated authority. And I'm very interested in understanding how my son came to be systematically harassed in one of our schools, while the only adult who intervened on his behalf faces termination for doing so. Richardson's professional composure crumbled completely as the magnitude of her situation became clear. She had been implementing what she believed were district-mandated personnel decisions against the district's own CEO, whose child had been the victim of the very bullying that prompted those decisions. Dr. Chun, I had no idea we weren't informed. Your son's enrollment records don't indicate, Richardson stammered, searching for explanations that might salvage her position. My son's enrollment records show his mother as Sarah Chun, which is my legal name, Dr. Chun replied evenly. The fact that you didn't connect that information to the district CEO probably says something about assumptions made regarding Asian single mothers. The observation was delivered without accusation, but its implications were devastating. Richardson and her staff had made assumptions about Timothy's family based on superficial interactions, never bothering to investigate or understand the true circumstances of his background. Kaisha found her voice despite her shock. You let Timothy suffer through months of bullying without intervening? You watched him eat lunch alone and be excluded from activities while having the power to stop it? Dr. Chun turned to face Kaisha with an expression of profound sadness. Ms. Williams, one of the most difficult aspects of my position is watching my son navigate school experiences that I could easily resolve with executive authority, but which would rob him of authentic social development. So you chose to let him be tormented? Kaisha asked, struggling to understand the logic behind such a decision. I chose to observe how our schools truly function when administrators believe they're dealing with powerless families, Dr. Chun replied. Timothy's experience has provided invaluable insights into systemic failures that I never would have discovered through official reports or scheduled visits. Richardson stood frozen beside them, clearly realizing that her handling of Timothy's situation had been under executive scrutiny without her knowledge. Every decision she had made regarding the bullying reports, parent complaints, and teacher advocacy had been observed and evaluated by the district's highest authority. The results have been both illuminating and deeply disappointing, Dr. Chun continued, her gaze shifting between Kaisha and Richardson. My son reported that only one adult in this building consistently treated him with dignity and advocated for his welfare. That same adult is now being terminated for providing exactly the kind of support that should be standard in every classroom. Dr. Chun, if I had known about Timothy's situation, if we had understood the severity, Richardson began desperately. You did know about Timothy's situation, Dr. Chun interrupted firmly. Ms. Williams documented incidents, filed reports, and requested administrative support multiple times. The severity was clearly communicated through proper channels. Kaisha watched Richardson's face cycle through emotions ranging from panic to resignation as she realized that her responses to Timothy's bullying reports were now being evaluated by the person who controlled her employment. The difference, Dr. Chun continued, is that you chose to prioritize maintaining relationships with influential families over protecting vulnerable students. When the Phillips family complained about accountability, you immediately moved to silence the teacher rather than address the behavior. Asterisk, the analysis was clinical but devastating, laying bare the institutional priorities that had led to this crisis. Richardson had made calculated decisions based on perceived power dynamics, never realizing that the quiet family she was sacrificing actually possessed ultimate authority within the system. Ms. Williams, Dr. Chun said, turning back to Kaisha, I owe you an enormous debt of gratitude. You protected my son when no one else would, and you did so knowing it would cost you professionally. Kaisha struggled to process the surreal nature of the situation. I protected Timothy because it was the right thing to do, not because of who his mother was. I had no idea about your position. "I know," Dr. Chun replied with obvious appreciation. "That's exactly why your actions were so meaningful. You saw a vulnerable child who needed support, and you provided it without calculating potential benefits or consequences." Richardson finally found her voice again, though it shook with obvious desperation. "Dr. Chun, I sincerely apologize for any misunderstandings. If you could provide guidance on how to better handle similar situations in the future, Principal Richardson," Dr. Chun said with calm finality. "You've had 3 months to demonstrate effective leadership in addressing bullying and supporting teachers who advocate for students. The guidance you needed was already available in district policies that you chose not to follow." The implication was clear: Richardson's position was no longer secure. Her systematic failure to protect Timothy and support Kaisha had been observed by the one person with authority to hold her accountable for those failures. "As for Ms. Williams," Dr. Chun continued, "her administrative leave is hereby rescinded. She will return to her classroom immediately with a formal commendation for her dedication to student welfare and her courage in advocating for vulnerable children." Kaisha felt tears of relief and vindication welling in her eyes. Not only was her job secure, but her actions were being officially recognized as exemplary rather than problematic. "Furthermore," Dr. Chun added, "I will be implementing district-wide training on recognizing and responding to bullying, with Ms. Williams serving as a lead consultant on best practices for classroom intervention." The announcement transformed Kaisha from a terminated teacher into a district resource, her experience with Timothy's situation becoming the foundation for systemic improvements across all schools. "Dr. Chun," Kaisha said quietly, "what about Timothy? How do we help him recover from months of trauma and social isolation?" Dr. Chun's expression softened as she considered her son's emotional needs. "Timothy will receive comprehensive support services, including counseling and carefully structured social interventions. But most importantly, he'll return to a classroom where his teacher understands his worth and refuses to tolerate his mistreatment." "And Brandon Phillips?" Richardson asked tentatively, clearly hoping to demonstrate her newfound commitment to appropriate disciplinary action. "Brandon will receive intensive education about empathy, respect, and the impact of his choices on others," Dr. Chun replied. "His parents will also receive education about enabling versus supporting their child's development." The response suggested that Brandon's family would discover their influence was no longer sufficient to shield their son from accountability. The power dynamics that had protected him throughout the bullying campaign were about to shift dramatically. "Principal Richardson, you and I will meet tomorrow morning to discuss your future with the district," Dr. Chun said, her tone making clear that this conversation would not be merely advisory. Richardson nodded with the resignation of someone who understood that her career trajectory had been fundamentally altered by her response to the situation. As the immediate crisis resolved itself, Kaisha began unpacking the boxes she had filled just hours earlier. The classroom that had felt like a scene of professional destruction was being restored as her domain, but with new support and recognition that would enable her to advocate more effectively for vulnerable students. "Ms. Williams," Dr. Chun said, as she prepared to leave, "Timothy has spoken about you with profound gratitude and affection. You gave my son something more valuable than protection. You gave him the knowledge that adults exist who will stand up for what's right, regardless of personal cost." "Timothy is an extraordinary child," Kaisha replied. "He deserves nothing less than unwavering advocacy." "Yes, he does," Dr. Chun agreed. "And thanks to you, he now knows what that looks like." As Dr. Chun departed, Kaisha sat among her partially unpacked teaching materials and marveled at the morning's dramatic reversals. Timothy's quiet mother had revealed herself as the district's most powerful figure, transforming what seemed like career destruction into professional vindication and expanded opportunity. But more importantly, Timothy would return to a classroom where his safety and inclusion were guaranteed not just by teacher dedication, but by institutional authority that would no longer tolerate his mistreatment. The revolution that began with one teacher's refusal to abandon a vulnerable student had ultimately reached the highest levels of educational leadership, promising systemic changes that would protect countless other children facing similar struggles. Sometimes the most powerful allies appeared in the most unexpected forms, and sometimes standing up for what was right led to outcomes more transformative than anyone could have imagined. 3 weeks after the shocking revelation in Kaisha's classroom, Jefferson Elementary had undergone a transformation that extended far beyond personnel changes. Dr. Sarah Chun's presence as district CEO had become known throughout the school community, sending ripples of accountability through every hallway, every administrative decision, and every interaction between staff and students. Timothy Chun walked through those same hallways with a different posture now. His shoulders were straighter, his steps more confident, and for the first time since kindergarten, he made eye contact with classmates who passed him in the corridors. The invisible shield of protection that his mother's authority provided was less important than the internal strength he had discovered through witnessing genuine advocacy in action. Kaisha observed these changes with professional satisfaction and personal joy. Her morning routine had returned to its familiar rhythm, but with enhanced purpose. Each lesson plan now incorporated specific strategies for inclusion and empathy building that would benefit not just Timothy, but every student who had ever felt marginalized or overlooked in academic settings. The district-wide anti-bullying training that Dr. Chun had implemented was revolutionary in its approach. Rather than focusing solely on punishment and reporting procedures, the program emphasized emotional intelligence, perspective-taking, and the development of classroom communities where diversity was celebrated rather than merely tolerated. Brandon Phillips sat at his usual desk, but his demeanor had undergone the most dramatic transformation of all. The intensive counseling sessions with district specialists had forced him to confront the impact of his actions in ways that traditional disciplinary measures never could have achieved. For the first time in his 9 years, Brandon was learning to consider how his words and behaviors affected other people's feelings and self-worth. Breakthrough in Brandon's understanding came during a particularly powerful counseling session, where he was asked to write letters from Timothy's perspective, describing what it felt like to experience systematic exclusion and humiliation. The exercise had reduced him to tears as he finally grasped the profound loneliness and pain he had inflicted on his classmate. The pivotal moment in Timothy and Brandon's relationship occurred on a gray December morning when Brandon approached Timothy's desk before the start of class. Students nearby fell silent, expecting another confrontation, but Brandon's expression carried none of his former arrogance or hostility. "Timothy," Brandon said quietly, his voice shaking with genuine emotion, "can I talk to you for a minute?" Timothy looked up from his morning journal with cautious curiosity. Months of conditioning had taught him to expect cruelty from Brandon's attention, but something in the other boy's tone suggested this interaction would be different. "I want to apologize," Brandon continued, his words carefully chosen and obviously rehearsed. "I've been really mean to you since school started, and I know I made you feel bad about yourself. That wasn't okay, and I'm sorry." The simplicity of the apology was more powerful than elaborate explanations or justifications would have been. Timothy studied Brandon's face, reading sincerity in his classmate's expression for the first time in their shared academic history. "Why? Were you mean to me?" Timothy asked, not with accusation but with genuine curiosity about motivations he had never understood. Brandon shifted uncomfortably, clearly struggling with self-reflection that was still new and difficult for him. "I think I was scared that you were smarter than me, and I didn't understand why you liked different things. Instead of trying to be your friend, I decided it was easier to make other kids not like you either." The honesty was breathtaking in its vulnerability. Brandon was acknowledging not only his cruel behavior, but the insecurity and fear that had motivated it. Timothy recognized courage in this admission, understanding intuitively that apologizing in front of classmates required the same kind of bravery he had shown in enduring months of harassment. "I accept your apology," Timothy said simply, extending a small but significant gesture of forgiveness that would reshape both boys' understanding of conflict resolution and human dignity. Kaisha watched this exchange from her desk, pretending to review lesson plans while actually witnessing one of the most meaningful moments of her teaching career. The transformation she was observing went beyond behavioral modification to encompass genuine empathy development and character growth. Brandon's public apology created immediate changes in classroom dynamics that extended far beyond his relationship with Timothy. Other students who had participated in or silently endorsed Timothy's exclusion began questioning their own behavior and seeking opportunities to make amends. Aisha, the bright student who had been caught between her natural kindness and social pressure, became the first classmate to actively include Timothy in group activities. During a collaborative art project, she specifically requested Timothy as her partner, citing his creativity and attention to detail as valuable contributions to their shared work. Derek, one of Brandon's former followers, surprised everyone by asking Timothy about the advanced books he was always reading. Their conversation about science fiction and fantasy novels revealed shared interests that had been hidden beneath layers of social conformity and peer pressure. The transformation wasn't limited to Timothy's immediate classmates. Teachers throughout Jefferson Elementary began implementing the new inclusion strategies they had learned during Dr. Chun's mandated training sessions. Hallway interactions became more intentional, recess supervision became more proactive, and classroom management incorporated emotional intelligence principles that benefited every student. Mrs. Patterson, the former substitute who had briefly taken over Keisha's classroom, approached Timothy privately to apologize for not recognizing or addressing his struggles during her temporary tenure. Her acknowledgement of professional shortcomings demonstrated the kind of accountability that was becoming standard throughout the district. Perhaps the most remarkable change in Timothy's school experience was the emergence of his own voice and agency. Months of having others speak for him or about him had given way to increasing confidence in advocating for himself and others who might be struggling with similar challenges. During a class discussion about kindness and inclusion, Timothy raised his hand and shared his perspective on what it felt like to be excluded, and how much it meant when someone chose to include him. His articulate explanation helped other students understand the emotional impact of their social choices in ways that adult lectures never could have achieved. When people don't talk to you or invite you to play, it makes you think there's something wrong with you, Timothy explained to his captivated classmates. But when someone is kind to you, it reminds you that you're okay just the way you are. The simple wisdom in Timothy's words resonated throughout the classroom and beyond, as teachers began incorporating his insights into their own discussions about empathy and community building. Timothy also began displaying leadership qualities that had been suppressed by months of social trauma. He started a lunchtime book club for students who preferred quieter activities, creating a space where intellectual curiosity was celebrated rather than hidden. The club attracted not only naturally introverted students, but also children who were discovering that academic interests could coexist with social acceptance. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.